employees, attempting to do the job in the best way possible, and yet the cloud is put on them because of people who are willing to misuse their purposes and the cards and tools that they have, and so help us out with that. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Mulvaney.
Thank the Chairman. Mr. Myberg, I want to go back and follow up on a couple of questions that were raised during your discussion with Mr. Palmer. He was talking specifically about a circumstance in Alabama where, to use his language, there was an allegedly overzealous EPA employee. We hear this all the time. It ranges from the terms overzealous to shakedown, depending on who you're talking to. And I guess the question that didn't get asked, because we sort of ran out of time, is this. Has anybody ever been fired for doing that?
Congressman, I can't cite a specific example of somebody, and I'm going to interpret your question, and I need to know if I'm hearing it correctly, that been fired for
overreaching, using their position to intimidate somebody, using their position. Enforcing the law is what we hire you folks to do, right? But occasionally, I guess it's possible that a bureaucrat, that a government employee might overreach. They might not like the person they're dealing with. They might not like what they're doing. They might not approve of the business that person is in. I used to be a real estate developer, and I can assure you that there's a lot of folks who like to hug trees who don't like what I used to do for a living. So the temptation might be there for an ordinary human being to sort of use that power that the government gives to them as an employee of the state to say, you know what, I'm gonna push a little harder here. I'm gonna stick it to this person. Do you remember a single circumstance of anybody at the EPA ever being fired for that in your 40 years there?
Congressman, first of all, I appreciate your observation about the job of law enforcement is oftentimes not a popular job or one designed to make everybody like you. I am not aware in my own experience of a case that's similar to what I'm hearing you say as someone who overused or abused their authority and was subsequently terminated solely for that reason. But I'll ask the staff to go back and look and see if there is such a thing.
Okay. Mr. Sullivan, if there were allegations of that, like in the example that Mr. Palmer mentioned, that someone had been overzealous and perhaps exceeded their authority, let's use that term, maybe that's a little bit more neutral, would that rise to the level of something the OIG would look at?
It could, and this is the first I'm hearing, though, Mr. Palmer brought this issue up. It has not been, to my knowledge, referred to the Inspector General's office as an allegation of misconduct.
Gotcha. And again, I'm using his as an example. He knows much more about his example in Alabama than I ever will. But so my question is more general. Have you ever investigated allegations of overreaching authority on the part of an EPA employee?
Yes. Yes.
Do you recall anybody ever being terminated for that action?
Off the top of my head, I can't recall specifically how the cases were adjudicated, but for example, we had allegations of people using their position to get a favor, something that's not readily available to a average citizen.
Okay.
Those type of instances. We've also had instances where people may have used government property to their personal gain, misused the government vehicle, let's say, misused government funds.
Okay, and there's actually, there was a fairly high profile, at least it's high profile to us, because it's in our briefing materials, about the employee in, I guess, the San Francisco area who lent out a trailer or a piece of equipment to an environmentalist group or something like that. Are you gentlemen familiar with those facts and circumstances?
I am familiar with that case.
And again, that person wasn't fired.
Was not fired.
So maybe my question is this, in my last minute, give me a couple of examples. What does it take to get fired from the EPA? What do you have to do? Do I have to kill somebody, or is it a little short of that?
It can be a little short of that,
okay.
Yes. There are cases where we've done terminations. In my experience, I've done terminations, and the kinds of behaviors that are involved are pretty unpleasant and not the kind of things that you would certainly want to ever have an employee engage in. But when they engage in those kind of things on a case-by-case basis, considering employees' due process rights and making sure that as a deciding official you've got all the facts, you've proved the allegations, proven that you followed the regulations, the process, that you do in fact terminate employees.
Help me understand, Mr. Myberg, and I recognize the fact that we're speaking in generalities, but If you had to sort of estimate between, when you're dealing with allegations of impropriety, and they're serious allegations, and you determine them to be valid allegations, that actually some substance to them, what percentage of people quit or retire versus get fired under those circumstances?
Congressman, I don't have an exact percentage, but it is not uncommon that people who find themselves faced with a proposed termination will make an election to retire or resign.
And if they retire or resign, they get to keep their benefits, right?
And we have no authority under law.
I'm not saying that you do, but the answer is yes. They don't. They do get to keep their benefits.
Except in some very limited cases that involve treason or espionage or aiding terrorist groups.
So let me close with this. As a manager, which is what you are, you manage people, right? I used to do it, you do it, you've done it for a long time with the EPA. Would it actually make your job easier if we gave you that additional tool to, on a case-by-case basis, or perhaps expand the existing case-by-case basis, to deny people who have been found to have acted improperly, to deny them some or all of their benefits even if they choose retirement or resignation over termination?
Congressman, I think I would answer that simply by saying that I think we have the abilities under our existing administrative tools to appropriately address conduct and misconduct and to hold employees accountable. And I'd want to make sure we're using those tools as effectively as we can.
But if we gave you this additional tool, it would help you, wouldn't it? Could?
That would be speculation, Congressman. I really couldn't say.
We do it all the time. But thank you very much, Mr. Myberg. I appreciate it.
I thank the gentleman. I now recognize the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Pascat, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning.
Good morning.
During last April's hearing at the EPA management issues, Chairman Chaffetz highlighted what he called, and I quote, management failures at the EPA. I'm not sure if that characterization is an appropriate one, and it appears that we're still in discussion about this today. But I wanted to discuss what has occurred since last April. And it's my understanding that the EPA has taken significant steps to address weaknesses in the disciplinary process. I don't think that necessarily firing a bunch of people means that you're a good manager. That may be the sign of a poor manager that constantly has to fire people rather than bring them up to speed and make them an appropriate worker. But Mr. Myberg, your testimony described the progress EPA has made, and you state, and I'm quoting here, as a result of the work of this committee, and especially Ranking Member Cummings, we have improved our working relationship with OIG, which has enabled us to take more efficient administrative actions. Would you care to elaborate on that, sir, on that statement?
Only to say, again, that this has been a two-way street, and we feel that we have reached out to the Inspector General's office. The Inspector General's office has reached out to us in pursuit of a common objective, which is we want to make sure that employees are held accountable and the conduct and the misconduct cases are dealt with appropriately, while also making sure that we do that in a way that protects people.
So how is that different than your relationship previously?
I really couldn't say for the agency as a whole from before the time I got here, but I think there's been reach out on both sides, and it's really commendable.
Mr. Sullivan, would you agree with that? And your statement, I'm going to quote from you, that the agency's internal adjudication process has dramatically improved. Is that correct? And
Yes, Ms. Plaskett. So I'll explain the difference. Prior to us having this biweekly meeting, for example, if we had a misconduct investigation in Denver or San Francisco, the folks at headquarters had very little visibility on that, and it may languish for months or years. Whereas now, every misconduct investigation that's pending across the agency, Mr. Myberg's staff, the attorneys at EPA headquarters, and the labor and employee relations folks, we meet biweekly, and that case heretofore that may have been languishing in San